2, 1, contact. Welcome to the Simple House Podcast. I'm the founder of Simple House. I'm Clark Massey. I'm here with Laura Heeman. One of the things we wanted to do with the podcast was talk about some of the most important ministries that shape Simple House, but also I think should shape other ministries. And one of the two most important ones that helped us start Simple House was Exodus Youth Services. It's an old ministry in Washington, D.C., and it started out in the 80s, and there's almost no information about it online. When I looked around, I saw some interviews with Mary Lyman Jackson that are still online, and I saw Washington.
She's the founder. She's one of the founders,
right? And her husband was Reverend Logan Jackson. He was an Episcopalian priest who became Catholic and started Exodus. And we also need to disambiguize Exodus because there's also an Exodus youth group that's out in California, and there's also Exodus International. It has the whole homosexuality ministry thing going on. And this is not either of those. This is its own thing.
Just a small ministry, for families and kids in Washington, D.C.
And when you and I came to it, it must have been about 01, 02 was around when we came. And that's how we met, right? Yep. And it had been going on since the mid-'80s. Mm-hmm. And it was this really interesting situation where we would meet in front of the shrine in Washington, D.C., get a bunch of people together, often anywhere from, say, 6 to a dozen is my memory, load people up. Sometimes we literally had a Winnebago.
Yep.
And we would drive to, I think, the oldest public housing complex in Washington, D.C. It was founded by Franklin Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. And it would always be about 7 o'clock at night after dark. And the goal was to have a Bible study for the kids in the basement.
And this was like a rough neighborhood.
Yes, to put it, yes. Yeah. And it was also weird because a lot of us had never been to a public housing neighborhood before. And we're going after dark, in the winter. And we had just to give a picture of it, it's really hard to understand the ministry. We'd have these people that I remember calling Pied Pipers. I don't know if that was my term or everyone's term, but their goal was they were so good with the kids and they would walk down the street and all these kids would chase them and they'd all want to come to Bible study. We'd have this Bible study. We were given access to a room in the basement of the public housing complex. And the Bible study was completely off the hook, right?
It was a madhouse.
When people sometimes say and they were hanging from the ceiling, and they're
they were literally.
Yeah, that was a literal issue we had. They would hang from the ceiling. I mean, that's just how wild it was. And we even had to assign bouncers. So there'd be someone at the door taking kids out of Bible study, kicking them out, and then we had bouncers on the other side of the door who would hang out with the kids who got kicked out. And it was the only way to keep order. And really, the whole goal was if you could keep their attention for 15 minutes before you start bouncing kids, you were excellent. You were probably brand new because they like to listen to the new people. They didn't like to listen to the older people. And, but if you could in any way have a quality discussion for 15 to 30 minutes before it all fell apart, you were doing well.
Yeah.
That's my memory, right?
One of the to enter into the Bible study, it was you would say hi to each kid and pray over him real quick. And that was your entry ticket.
And that was kind of a sweet thing. That felt very special, And
I think the kids thought it was special.
It was special. And then sometimes after the Bible study, we would be throwing footballs or just doing little things with the kids outside. And the part of the ministry that was kind of overlooked, but I think it's how Laura and I met, and it's also probably the most important part for the formation of Simple House, was going door to door and meeting the moms, which it was almost always moms. These were all single mother families in this neighborhood. And the moms, when they came to the door, were shocked. They were shocked that someone had knocked on their door. They were shocked it was you. They were shocked you were there. And they were so shocked. They were also very open.
Yeah.
I felt like they were just sure, let's
Yeah.
talk.
Yeah, right.
And they would, I felt like that was very moving to me, because at the same time I was doing work at the Catholic Worker with the homeless, and it was largely men, and they were often very practiced in the way they would deal with you. They wouldn't open up or really be that open for sincere friendship. They met so many volunteers. That was just a part of their daily routine, was to say hi and bye to people, right? And these women,
and I think like a big difference was the men coming to the Catholic Worker were like going there. They were seeking out a service. Right. They had it together enough to get there, and there was a sense you go to these doors that a lot of these women just felt like the world had forgotten them and like did not know they were there.
I think that's right. I wouldn't have said it that way, but I think that's very true. And the way I've kind of said it is that the homeless, which are largely men, receive very good church support. In DC, it's almost too good. It's like there's literally lines of people waiting to feed the homeless. Yeah. The soup trucks have to form in a line to get their turn to serve the homeless.
Literally, right?
Literally, it's weird. But the women in the public housing neighborhood had received much better government services, like they'd received housing for one, and probably different types of welfare, food stamps, WIC, and then the temporary need for TANF, type services. But they had received very little church service. The kind of personal type of ministry they hadn't received any of. So the homeless men were very practiced with church people, and the families were not, and they were just like really awesome and open to wanting to chat and share about their lives and tell us. I mean, we were often far younger than the people we were visiting. Oh yeah. And so they're like educating us while we're there.
Sure. Yeah.
And I also, this is a little bit off topic. There was a very special woman in that neighborhood who, I don't want to say her name, but she was the most charismatic spiritual person I feel like I've ever met. And she would kind of prophesy. And I'm not a very charismatic person. I'm a pretty orderly Christian person, but I was always very moved by her. Yeah. Another thing that happened that really shaped, I'm sorry, I should ask Laura how this shaped you, but let me keep rambling. Another thing that really shaped me was hearing people's firsthand accounts of what they'd been through and kind of getting our eyes opened to struggle. Like I remember there was, cases where people had been so severely abused. They'd had kids, from, incest and things like that, and had horrible run-in, and were trying to re-find kids that had been taken away. Yeah. And it just wasn't their fault, Yeah. And I needed to see that in order to open my eyes, to understand, to not be shocked by the evil in the world. Right. Right. And these were really good people. I don't know how I can characterize the whole neighborhood as really good people, but they felt like that's the way I remember it. Yeah. But how did it shape you, Laura?
I think there's like a lot. I think one thing that this was like kind of my introduction to Exodus came like on the heels of like a deeper conversion for me, and it was really instrumental in my life. I think it was in yours. I think in my husband Ryan's, and one thing that was great about Exodus, like I had volunteered plenty at like soup kitchens in high school, and soup kitchens are great. But this like flipped the script a little bit. Like we were going to people's homes and we were guests in people's homes, and there was like something really beautiful about that. And it was like kind of like your I don't know, I sort of remember it being like a rite of passage for the Exodus missionaries. If you had been invited to this one woman's house and like had her cornbread, like that was like, and it was good. So this sort of being invited into people's lives, I don't know, that sort of, I think like flipped the script a little in a really interesting way. And it was like beautiful thing to let this woman be hospitable to you. Right. And go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to kind of change subject, but I think that personal nature of entering into those relationships was huge for Simple House.
Yeah.
And we stole inherited, were bequeathed one of the big slogans of Exodus, which is friendship evangelization.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm kind of, part of me is a little bit nervous about this podcast because, I love Mary Lyman Jackson, who's still out there, and this ministry has not been properly, in a sense, like, this ministry could help more people, just even the knowledge that it existed and what it did.
Yes.
And doesn't have a history. Right. And I don't think you and I can do justice to it. We were there at the end of it, Yeah. But I think we got to do something, and I'm not going to blame us if we don't do a perfect job.
Yeah.
But, so some of the people, do you have more ways that you want to share about it?
Yeah, I want to say another thing. So, you said, so we would get together at the shrine, and then, part of the ministry was, I don't know how long it was, like maybe like 45 minutes or an hour of preparation, of like praying and, assigning roles to everyone and, preparing ourselves to go out and it was expected. I remember, Mary, telling us that we should be praying, for the people we were helping throughout the week. And I think for me, this was like how I started understanding really that like prayer changes things, and I think this was very influential on our ministry. Like, we pray before every time we go out, do anything. We pray before a planning meeting, like we're always praying before we do anything and then praying after. And I think that was a thing that made this, very powerful.
Also just the legacy of the people we met who were with Exodus. Mm-hmm. What I'm thinking is like, you and I met there. Your mm-hmm. husband was there. I think my wife might have gone out once with Exodus. I'm not mm-hmm. sure. Our board members and just been with us from the very beginning and start of Simple House, Mike and Liz, they were both leaders of Exodus when we mm-hmm. arrived, mm-hmm. and we have a huge person who supported Simple House who's awesome, who's Sister Kateri of the CFRs. Mm-hmm. She was Sister leading Exodus. Mm-hmm. Sister Ann Kateri, right?
Yeah.
Yes. All right. We knew her as Catherine Ham at the time. And she supported Simple House a lot, but she also was just the leader who just would bring us out there for the mm-hmm. first year or so that I was involved. And I'm sure they've got memories of when Exodus was younger than we mm-hmm. do, because they sometimes refer back to the days when they, different days I don't really have anything to say about. But and then at the end, there was a friend of ours, Susan Shaughnessy, and she worked at the JP2 Institute out at Catholic U, and she became one of the very last leaders bringing Exodus out, and she also helped with Simple House quite a bit because the founding mm-hmm. of Simple House and Exodus continuing to exist overlaps some. Mm-hmm. And even Mary Lyman Jackson, who, so her husband, Logan Jackson, I don't really understand if they kind of mutually founded it or if her husband founded it and then she took it over. He basically got sick with Lou Gehrig, so Mary had to take the lead on Exodus. Mm-hmm. And he passed before we joined. Mm-hmm. But Mary, in the first 6 months of Simple House, we had some discernment crises. And she was generous with her time. And at one point just told me what I had to do. And she was absolutely right when she told me what I had to do. And it was very good to have someone in my life who had run a ministry who also could just see more clearly than I could at the moment and clarify things, Mm-hmm. And Susan Shaughnessy, who I mentioned, she passed on. I can't remember if Exodus maybe stopped a year before she passed, but she passed very young. I think she was mm-hmm. in her 20s, and mm-hmm. just kind of a special person to remember. What else do we want to say about this and how this affected the beginning of Simple House?
I think like the kind of observations we made there, like totally informed our ministry and how we were gonna be. And when you were starting a Simple House, there was like a question we were trying to answer of like, who was the poorest of the poor in the city? And I think without doing Exodus, we would have had a different answer for that. And it's like kind of weird to compare who's like poorer, but like you said, there's like so much available for homeless people here. There's like every service available times 10 per service,
Now, if I was young listening to what you and I are saying right now, I'd be like, well, why don't we have an Exodus right now? What if I go start one right now, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to say that, like, you need a dose of the Holy Spirit to do it, but you need a good dose of common sense to do it too.
Oh, yeah.
It is not the most safe thing in the world.
Yeah.
And I think the way that you have to, if you want to...
what I think about Exodus is like, it was like a foolish thing that was blessed.
Really?
I don't want to say that Mary Lyman Jackson was foolish, but I feel
we
were like young and naive and going out, and somehow God blessed it.
I feel like you're saying it's unreproducible at some level. I don't know that that's true.
Okay.
If I was to say one insight into if you ever were to reproduce it, is you just do not go into these neighborhoods just like arrive. You need to know the leaders of the neighborhood, befriend the leaders of the neighborhood, which in the case of public housing is almost always grandmas.
Yeah.
And if you are friends with the grandmothers, the main grandmothers, the guys on the street, the guys doing the drugs, the people running around, they'll be on your side.
Yeah.
And I think that, it's not wise to go into a lot of these neighborhoods after dark. I would not do that today even, I think that it was only because we had such a pattern and had been in that neighborhood for, it seems like over a decade by the time you and I even started, Yeah.
And, I don't know if you ever, helped in this. I don't know. There was a lot of, there were like, once or twice a week, Catherine or Sister Annie Cattery, and like maybe another missionary. And I joined in this a number of times, would go and like do Bible studies with the grandmothers, like during the day, and there was a real, friendship building there. And there was like a real, like mutuality, like it was like a real back and forth, in that relationship. It wasn't just like, we're coming to serve you.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever did that. I did one thing that was always kind of a crazy story for me. One of the things about Exodus that was challenging is they told you what you were going to teach that day. You know what I mean? It was like, you're going to go over the Sunday readings, go. And I'm like, look, I was just like, look, let us teach anything we want, just because, as long as it's basically Christian good news, because the Bible says we're so hard to control anyway. Why are you limiting what we can cover, But it was also good because it forced you to do that. So I remember one time going into the neighborhood during the day to meet the moms and the grandmas, and they had all come together in like a class type thing in the place we usually had our Bible studies. I don't remember what the occasion was. But we were somehow supposed to talk about the 10 Commandments. And I got to the one, and I was assigned like, don't commit adultery and marriage. And it was like, no one had a successful marriage in the audience. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, what am I supposed to do? Yeah, I'm not married. I'm just single. And it's just like, what am I supposed to do here, with this audience, right? And I remember standing up there and being like, well, I think I'll talk about the goodness of marriage, and then I think I'll just state the commandment, and I'll just be, because I didn't want to just like make it wishy-washy or whatever, right?
Right.
And I remember I did this, and then the women started clapping.
Yeah.
And it was just like such a horrible, I was doing such a bad job teaching, but they were just happy. They were like, yeah, tell it the way it is. Yeah. I was like, oh, this is a kind of a different culture than I'm used to. I'm surprised people aren't walking out right now.
Right. You just like touched all the touchy issues.
I know, right?
Yeah.
So, I think one of the things I do with New Simple House missionaries is I'm trying to encourage them to pursue, in a sense, their ministry, even if it goes beyond Simple House, right? Mm-hmm. And I think one of the useful things in knowing about more ministries is it kind of increases your horizon about what's possible.
Yeah.
Right. I think there's so many people go into public housing, often not Catholics, often other Christian groups, who do like youth services. And that's very good and important. And I found no one who really thinks that's a negative. But, but figuring out how to reach the mothers, I think that's part of what Simple House set out to do. And it's something that's just not done.
Yeah. I mean, and I think I think about that being like a huge influence from Exodus. Like I remember sending kids back, from the Bible studies, like sending them home. And it was like, I don't know if you remember this. It was like crazy to convince them to go home, partly because it's like they're allowed to be out at night and they, it's like Thursday night. So they're allowed to be, but it was like some of the things they were going back to, it was like so heartbreaking and, kind of give me a pit in my stomach to send them home. And so there's like always so much talk about like the youth are the future. And it was like, well, what homes are these youth going back to? Like that was a question. And then the other thing is like, well, the youth are the future, but these adults, their mothers, they have a future too, and they're not too far gone.
Right. I think that's almost an article of faith. They're not too far gone.
Right.
We need to have hope for everyone. And I also think we want to not over-characterize it. Like, a public housing neighborhood is a group of families that at some level have been broken. And some are amazing the way they're handling it. Mm-hmm. But they're all in this difficult situation that, like, they're clustered together. Yeah. And so it's not that every family was sad to send the child home to, but it was kind of sad that they just weren't seeing a marriage, and they weren't seeing people that oftentimes they weren't even seeing people who would work a 40-hour week job.
Like never.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
And like a couple weird kind of things.
I think about like, so it's like a cluster of people with like very broken lives. And one of the things, it's like a paradox, or it's like because there is so much brokenness, like there's also this sort of great like unitive fabric, because, you have to like kind of take care of this other person's kid a little bit to help them like have a chance, or, your neighbor's hungry now and you might be hungry later in the month. And so there's like amazing generosity that you don't see anywhere else, where like there's not this kind of brokenness, right? So it's like both like so broken and amazingly generous.
I would just say heroic, it's kind of just what Christ meant when he said, "Blessed be the poor." Like some of the things we saw just validated, "Blessed be the poor." They have great spiritual gifts. I think that like if you've experienced real poverty, things about God that no theology class will ever teach you. Yeah. And you should not be shy about owning that fact. Yeah. Yeah. Two things that I remember that I don't know if there's much lesson from this, but they were just worth mentioning, it feels like, is that we once decided that we were going to do a curriculum on chastity. Mm-hmm. And I remember Sister Kateria was there, and we talked about breaking up the guys and the girls. Mm-hmm. One of the things about the ministry was we were very popular amongst the kids. The boys kind of quit coming usually around 10 and then would show up sporadically. And the girls would stick around longer, like 13 or 14, and then kind of quit showing up. Mm-hmm. And some, did show up later. I don't want to act like there was nobody, but and some would just come back and have a good time once, during like the winter, as opposed to come every week. But I remember we split them up, and I remember with the boys, I was there with a different Exodus missionary, and I made probably an inappropriate joke that I had to bail this guy out of jail, and no one flinched. And then I was like, I'm kidding, he wasn't in jail. And then they go, well, have you ever been in jail? And he's like, I've never been in jail. And they were like, no way. And that was kind of telling, what the situation was like, right?
Yeah.
And another thing that happened was we had, we were doing that chastity thing, and it was like we separated the girls, and one of the older girls was going to help talk about the issues, and she just said, don't have sex until you're 18, don't have a baby until you're 21. There you go.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like, whoa,
Yeah.
And I remember another time that a former missionary nun came back, and the girls were just crying that they couldn't believe that she was a virgin.
Mm-hmm.
Like 14, 15-year-old girls were just crying in front of her and hugging her,
Yeah.
And
that
I
was
don't
often
even know what that all means.
I feel like that question, all the volunteers obviously were like trying to live Christian lives, and I feel like it was a preoccupation, like, which one of you are virgins? Like they couldn't believe that was like
right.
a thing.
And it wasn't something we were talking about, right? It wasn't like a main point,
Yeah.
But it was a witness, know.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I still haven't processed everything we went through 20 years ago with that ministry.
Yeah. Did you ever go to Adams Morgan?
Maybe once.
Yeah, because I had like a year where I was going, that's another neighborhood in DC, and it's kind of like party neighborhood and expensive houses now.
It is now. I actually was living in Adams Morgan, I think, when Exodus went to Adams Morgan. And it was funny because I was in this like kind of rundown apartment building. Mm-hmm. And I was like the only single, I don't want to say white guy, but more like guy with a job in the building. Yeah. But there were many single women with good jobs in the building. Like they needed the cheaper rent or something. And it kind of blew my mind because I was like a little bit afraid to live there. But I feel like that's kind of been a thing I've seen my whole life, that sometimes it's the single women who actually are the braver ones to move into the rougher neighborhoods, But anyway, so we were in this building. I remember Exodus. It was just ironic to me that I was like serving with the ministry, and then sometimes the ministry would pull up in front of my own building. Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember when I started at Exodus, they hadn't been going to Adams Morgan for a while. And then I was like there the first night we went back. And it was like we went in the RV into the neighborhood, and there were people running down the street after the RV, like excited, like happy. Yeah, because they remembered it, or their moms remembered it, or something.
And that neighborhood was really changing at that moment, as evidenced by me living there,
Right. Yeah. And on that particular street, it was kind of, at that time it was like, you go down this street, you don't go down that street, maybe, as kind of the idea. And then there was a main strip, on 18th Street that just was full of all kinds of characters,
That decade I lived in DC, the way the city was changing was so predictable and like a march. It was like, this is a transitional neighborhood. Next year, it will be that block. Yeah. You know what I mean? It was usually like a 3 or 4 block window moving east, Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was like, don't go to North Capitol Street. Then it was like, okay, it's okay to go to Capitol Street. Then it's like, actually, you can't afford to live on North Capitol Street. Kind of. Yeah. So. Yeah. All right. Anything else you want to say? We want to, Mary Lyman Jackson, if you listen to this, thank you for everything, Yeah. And I do think there's probably a lot of room to have former Exodus missionaries come and do a podcast about just their stories. I mean, I think Mike and Liz, both leaders of Exodus, would be great. Sister Kateri, I'm sure, has almost too many stories. So
right, yeah.
I'm sure Mary Lyman Jackson has infinity stories. But
do you want to talk about race and volunteering?
Go for it. We'll cut it out if it's too weird.
Yeah. one thing that would happen at Exodus is like we were primarily going in at this kind of short few hour time frame, you know, on Thursday nights, and we got to know some people really well, but other people not as well. And I think for the volunteers, it was like, you know, you remembered, oh, I had this meaningful moment with this boy, and I will always remember that. And I met so-and-so, and it was so moving. And, you know, the people were forming like really strong impressions on our mind. And I remember realizing at some point that like the kids and the families, like they loved Exodus, but like they didn't really know our names. And we knew a lot of their, I think a lot of us knew a lot of their names, right? Or all of, you know, everyone's name. And there was a thing that I realized that it was like they just saw us kind of as like interchangeable, nice white people.
You know, I agree and I disagree.
Yeah.
I don't know that the race part was an important part of that interchangeability. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Well,
I think like maybe part of it why it wasn't
anything else.
Yeah, but I think part of the reason why it was like a lot of those kids didn't know a lot of white people, and like they thought we looked alike, you know.
That's interesting, because I don't think people realize that. Like, DC was so segregated at that time mm-hmm. that it was so rare. Like, I remember looking at the demographics of a neighborhood we were looking at. Yeah. It was 99% African American. Yeah. That means white, Asian, Hispanic was 1%, like all in one, right? Yep. Yeah. Probably also the people who just refused to say what they were in that 1%, you know?
Right.
And so it's something that, like, I feel like in the popular culture, it's probably too risque to say this now, but people used to joke about not being able to tell Asian people apart or whatever.
Right.
And I think it's just like, if you're not around a lot of Asian people, it's hard.
Yeah.
You don't recognize differences, right? But if you're around Asian people, it's after a while you start thinking it's stupid that these people can't tell them apart. It's like, look, they look very different. What are you talking about? You know? And that was something that happened in DC, where it was like there were people who'd seen who just didn't interact with white people hardly at all.
Yeah.
And they would tell me that. They'd be like, I remember there was a woman who had my same last name. And I thought that was, it was kind of a funny thing we connected on, right? Mm-hmm. Next time I saw her, I call her by her name and she goes, "Oh, you're Mr. Massey." And I'm like, and she goes, "And honestly, I couldn't even told that you were Mr. Massey, except you called me by my name. So I just figured out, you know, like she goes, all white people look the same to me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She just told me that outright. And I was like, wow. I never thought about that before.
Yeah. Well, but you know, like, on the flip side, like volunteers that were new and maybe had not spent a lot of time with Black people or in that setting, like, would have a hard time with names, like couldn't figure out people's names or how to spell it or anything like that, you know, just because the names were different. And so I felt like that was like kind of the reverse, you know, and maybe even would confuse people too. I don't remember, but I don't know. I think that it is like an interesting thing to think about ministry and like, are you personally connecting with someone, or I don't know. What do you think?
I want to say two things. Mm-hmm. I'll get to the personal connection thing second, but I feel like a lot of people will hear what we're saying about the race situation as like negative, as problem, as whatever. And
really,
I'm
not trying to say that. Yeah,
that's not really the right way to think about it.
Yeah,
it's like, if you're ever going to get beyond this, you got to go get your feet wet. And when you get your feet wet, there's going to be some embarrassing blind spots in your knowledge, right? And if you never go through those blind spots, you're never going to get to the core issue, you know?
Yeah.
And then the other thing about it is, I think this happens at Simple House today, and it has nothing to do with race in my mind, but it has to do with, like, we used to say at Exodus that you're standing on the shoulders of the people who kind of like went before you, right? Like, people would come up to you, you could be your first day with Exodus, and they would be generously thanking you for what the ministry's done, right? And you had done nothing. right?
Yeah.
And you shouldn't say, hey, I've done nothing, blah, blah. It's like, accept that gratitude, but you're being thanked for the work of people that were there before you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And even today with Simple House Ministry, like we'll bring in college students or just someone who wants to do a little bit of ministry, and I will bring them into a homeless camp or bring them into a family setting, and they will be warmly welcomed, not because of who they are, but because of the Simple House missionaries.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I tend not to think that it was like interchangeable white people situation. I think of it more like they were very thankful for that ministry, and they were thankful for everyone who gave their time to that ministry. It just so happened that all the people they were thanking were
well, not quite all. Not quite all the volunteers were white.
That's right.
We had a few black volunteers.
And the other funny thing was the Dominicans were very important to that ministry, the East Coast. And they unfortunately have this habit that looks weirdly similar to a KKK outfit, just a straight white robe, and they would go into the hood and at night, and it worked,
Yeah. Yeah.
I've always found the racial dimension of it to be merely interesting, not particularly useful.
Yeah.
I haven't found that it's useful for me.
Though, I guess right. So maybe it's like not the race thing that's as important. I don't know what is the thing that like bugged me about this, about people being interchangeable, on like both sides. Like, I think maybe because I hear people that like volunteer at something and they speak in this very like sappy way about how the people are all so beautiful, and and it's like or whatever, maybe the people were all beautiful in that, or it's like in a lot of generalizations, and I want to be like, did you talk to any of them really? And I think like the Holy Spirit was active in this ministry, and I think God was moving hearts, and but there was also something, I think there was like an obstacle to overcome,
I think,
for personal connection.
I think that some of the longtime missionaries had real personal friendships with both kids and parents
yes
in that
absolutely
neighborhood.
Yeah.
But we also had a crew of people who were just coming, and they might not come next year. They might do 10 sessions, and that was pretty good for them, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that with Simple House, what we wanted to change was we wanted to be there for people in a way that it was like their other friendships and like our other friendships.
Yeah.
And we wanted that to be the standard.
Yeah.
Like we weren't really interested in running a ministry that just got a bunch of people who hadn't been to the hood out in the hood.
Right.
We wanted to go deeper, and that wanted to be 100% of the ministry. And I think Exodus showed us that was possible, but Exodus was also a different type of ministry too. It was also a youth Bible study at night, and things like that, right? Where you didn't need to have super deep friendships with everybody. So I just think that's part of what we took from it, and part of why, like I've often said, like if we didn't think we needed to do anything different from another ministry, we would have never started one.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So anyway, I think that's pretty good recap of that. And the other major influence at Simple House is the Michael Kerwin Catholic Worker Houses. Even though neither of us have ever met Michael Kerwin, we met his family members who were running the houses. And so we'll do a podcast on that, and we hope to see you soon. And please leave comments and like the video. Talk to you later.
See you next time.